Okay, in this lecture today, we're going to be taking a look at World War II. We're going to be looking at the causes of World War II, and it basically starts with the aftermath of World War I. So to understand how the United States gets involved in World War II, to understand how World War II occurs, you kind of have to start at the end of World War I with the Treaty of Versailles. And hopefully you've had a lot of this in your world history class, and that you understand that a lot of the problems that are associated with the end of World War I, land taken from Germany, Germany being forced to pay extensive war reparations, countries feeling like they got gypped at the end of World War I, that a lot of those hard feelings that come out of that punitive treaty wind up leading to the rise of Hitler and the fascists in Italy and militarism in Japan and all that in the 1930s. And that it's not just the hard feelings that come out of the Treaty of Versailles, but it's also the economic problems, I would argue, that are created as a result of the Depression and countries' attempts to alleviate the Depression. But when we talk about this time period for the United States, we've got to look at what the United States is thinking at the end of the war. Now, there are three general schools of thought when it comes to how the United States should proceed. There are those at the end of World War I, and I would argue as we lead up to World War II, that believe that the United States needs to be involved in world affairs. That we not only need to be a player, but we need to be the player in world affairs. These are the people who believe in interventionism. We need to intervene. We need to step in and be involved in world affairs to promote democracy. Now, that's a Wilson idea, but it's also an FDR idea. Now, in 1920, Franklin Roosevelt had run for vice president. He was a young 39-year-old guy. So over the course of the next 12 years, he's going to get a little more experience, become a little more seasoned, but when he becomes president in 1932, to deal with the Depression, I think he also feels that the United States needs to be engaged in world affairs, that we cannot just sit back and allow the world to go about what it's doing. Now, I find it interesting, nobody ever talks about this, but Woodrow Wilson invaded the Soviet Union in 1920, or 1919. Actually, we tried to invade the Soviet Union to influence the communist revolution there. We had troops in the Soviet Union from 1919 to 1920 to 1921. So I mean, it's never on a test, but I think it's interesting that Wilson was willing to put his money where his mouth is when it came to democracy abroad. That Wilson in 1919 saw communism as the biggest threat to democracy, his goal of worldwide democracy, and was willing to put troops in place to do something about it. But at the end of World War I, a lot of people believed that the United States had overreached, that this idea of promoting democracy abroad cost too much money. It drew our attention away from what America does best, which is business. I mean, Calvin Coolidge famously says the business of America is business. And so a lot of politicians found that a good message for the 1920s, and I mean, Harding called it a return to normalcy. But what he was really talking about with regard to foreign policy was independent action. We, the United States, did not want to be tied to any alliance. to any organization. We did not want to be tied to the League of Nations. The League of Nations would require us to be constantly engaged in other countries' affairs. And that was not a very popular idea in the 1920s. We had gone to war in 1917 with the promise of making the world safe for democracy and fighting the war to end all wars. And yet, at the end of the war, you wound up with a very punitive treaty that punished Germany. The Treaty of Versailles was not about spreading democracy, it was about sticking it to the Germans. And I think a lot of Americans felt let down by the stated goals of going to war and the reality that you had afterwards. So Harding, Coolidge, a lot of Republicans argue that the United States needs to be able to act independently. It doesn't mean we're going to withdraw. It doesn't mean we're going to hide from the rest of the world. But we want to be able to act on our own American actions on behalf of American interests. So they are opposed to the League of Nations. As a matter of fact, the U.S. doesn't even ratify the Treaty of Versailles. We signed a separate peace treaty with Germany. We discussed the idea of disarmament. And as a matter of fact, the United States even hosts a conference, which I'll talk about in just a second, in 1922 to talk about that very thing. If you want to prevent war, fine, stop building weapons. There's an idea. If you don't have any weapons, good luck fighting a war. But really what these Republican administrations are trying to do is promote American business interests abroad and keep out cheap foreign goods. But when you get to the 1930s, and America is now mired in the Depression, and we've got 25% unemployment, and we've got all these horrific problems going on here in the United States, the voice that seems to be coming across loudest is the isolationist group. Now, they're around in the 1920s. These are your nativists. These are your KKK folks. These are the folks that are saying, close the gate to immigrants. They're the ones that get the National Origins Act and the Emergency Quota Act passed. But in the 1930s, they embraced something called America First. And it basically says this: let the world, if the world is going to go to war, let them. America needs to deal with its own problems here at home. We've got the Depression, we've got unemployment, we've got all these other problems we need to deal with. We cannot be concerned if Japan wants to invade China. If Japan wants to invade China and China can't stop them, oh well. If Germany wants to absorb the Rhine land and the Sudeten land and invade the rest of Czechoslovakia and Europe can't stop them, that's not our problem. So this idea becomes very popular in the 1930s against the backdrop of the Depression. This idea is popular in the 1920s, and then this idea is popular 1918 to 1920, but again, by 1940. So you actually kind of come full circle. Does that make sense? Anybody ever read those alternate history books that are out there? There's an alternate history book where Charles Lindbergh gets the Republican nomination for president in 1940 and keeps America out of World War II. That's they do. They write alternate history books. Alternative history. What would happen if? I mean, in 1940, Charles Lindbergh was a very popular political voice. And I mean, he had that hero status from the 1920s. I mean, he was, very well known. Everybody knew who Charles Lindbergh was. But Charles Lindbergh was advocating in the 1930s up until 1940, I would argue even into 1941, that America needed to mind its own business. And did not want America getting involved anywhere around the globe. And that idea, up until 1940, 41, is very popular. I mean, think about it. We got our own economic problems today, right? I mean, I don't care how long we've been out of a recession. A lot of people haven't felt it. And people are like, well, why are we still in Iraq? Why are we still in Afghanistan? Why do we got our fleet over here? Why do we got bases over there? Why are we constantly engaged here? We're spending all this money on this and all this. Why don't we bring our money back home? Spend our money here. You've got that attitude out there today. Yeah. I don't. Just look up Charles Lindbergh, alternate history. But yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating idea. I mean, Newt Gingrich wrote a book called, it was about if the South had won Gettysburg. Now, think about that one. There's an alternate history. Yeah, there's an alternate history for you. All right. So, what is American foreign policy like in the 1920s? Well, under Harding, and by the way, this is not Harding's doing, okay? Harding didn't come up with this idea. Under Harding, you've got Charles Evans Hughes, who later goes on to become Supreme Court Justice, goes on to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Charles Evans Hughes, Secretary of State, I want to say, he hosts a naval conference in Washington, D.C. in 1922 to talk about limits to naval vessels, limits to weapons, okay? And I mean, the weapon of the day is the battleship, all right? So the Washington Naval Conference talks about, a lot of the naval construction projects that are going on in the 1920s, that maybe we should put a limit or a cap on that stuff. We need to look at some other things that are out there. Notice what America seems to be focused on in the 1920s. Take a look at the different agreements that are made here. What is America focused on besides disarmament? Asia, okay? We are still working with the open door policy. The open door in China is still a cornerstone American policy. So the four-power treaty requires mandatory consultation between powers in conflict in Asia. Okay? And I think that treaty was signed between the United States, Great Britain, France, and Japan. That if there's going to be any threat, or if there's going to be any problem in Asia, those four countries have to say, time out, let's talk about it first. So that's not isolation, that's engagement, but it's engagement on America's terms. The nine-power treaty, that's kind of a treaty between the nine, big powers in the world to maintain the open door. The United States signs it, Britain signs it, France signs it, Russia signs it. Right, Russia signed it. Maybe not. China signed it, Japan signed it, and a couple other powers. Portugal may have signed it. And then you've got the five-power treaty, which is limits on battleship construction at what's called a 5-to-3 to 1.67 ratio. Countries are going to cap the number of ships, the number of battleships that they build.
I like it. Yeah, hands down. There you go.
Now, if you're Japan,
That sucks.
it sure does.
We could have.
And what are you doing
1.67.
with that .67 battleship, man?
Well, when the
How
war
does that
starts, you
thing
finish
float,
it.
huh?
When the war starts, you finish it.
That's right, yeah, exactly. Quick, guys. But yeah, I mean, you already see the insanity of that, and where Japan came off feeling like, we came here in good faith, and yet we feel like we got screwed in this process.
Feel like they did.
Well, why?
Because they're an island.
Because what?
They're an island.
So's Britain.
Well,
Try again.
because they beat Russia in a war.
Because what?
Are they a threat?
I don't know. Are they a threat?
They're a pretty good threat.
I think they're a threat. Maybe the United States, since they're hosting this conference, wants to make sure that their biggest rival in Asia, the biggest threat to the open door, doesn't have the military hardware to be able to put up any kind of resistance, perhaps. But what else might be at play here? Now, come on.
Racism.
Ah! How so?
Well, they're not white enough to have all the battleships.
Bingo! There you go. And that's exactly how the Japanese felt. They felt that this was racially motivated. And so Japan comes out of this with extraordinarily hard feelings against Western powers. As they should, perhaps.
Yeah.
They felt like they did not get treated fairly. And as a matter of fact, in the 1930s, Japan scraps this conference and they just start building. They build battleships and aircraft carriers. They build this, freaking 90,000-ton battleship, man. So yeah, I mean, they're like, yeah, we're not abiding by this. Question. Go.
That .675 would average out once the U.S. would make more ships.
It does.
So they're not going to have
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We
At
covered
first-
that
at
you
first-
can't have 2/3 of a battleship.
At first, I thought that it was like we were limited to that exact amount, where we can only have 5 battleships in the United States. And
That's
like ratio. Okay, that's a ratio.
It's just a ratio. And then in 1928, during the it was the Coolidge administration, the last days of the Coolidge administration, you had the signing of what was known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact, where the United States comes out and says, "We're outlawing war." Yeah, outlawing it. America. How do you outlaw war? And what happens if somebody violates that?
Well, then you shoot them.
What?
Is that the
guys,
definition of war, though?
this is pie in the sky foreign policy, man. This is dreamy time foreign policy. It doesn't make any sense.
Coolidge must have been sleeping at night.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. All right, so
Well, they did it first.
So the 1920s generally, in terms of U.S. foreign policy, is about de-escalating crises to avoid war. We're trying to avoid war. We don't want to have another world war like we had. So we'll get rid of weapons and we'll outlaw war and we'll hide under a pile of coats and hope everything works out in the morning. Done. Yeah. Now, one of the biggest problems that the United States is facing is that the European powers that had been borrowing money during World War I couldn't pay us back. So a lot of Americans felt like we had gotten, World War I felt like a giant diamond dash. That we came in, we're part of a large party at the restaurant. All of Europe gets up and goes, and we're left with the check. Yeah, that's a lot of money.
It's billions of dollars.
Yeah, that's billions of dollars right there in 1918 money.
My God.
So
Why do
this
they need all that money?
to
Well, I know
Fight
it's
a
a
world
world war,
war.
but still, that's
yeah,
a lot.
yeah. I mean, if you're building weapons and paying soldiers, it costs money. But the problem is that all of these countries wind up owing the United States money. Now, the plan that Europe had, the plan in particular that Britain and France had, was that they would be able to get their money from Germany.
No.
They'd just be able to soak Germany dry through war reparations. That was part of the Treaty of Versailles. Germany had to pay these huge war reparations. But as usual, Europe in its short-sightedness took away Germany's ability to
Smith, don't kill him.
Everyone take care.
Yeah, yeah.
as usual, in their infinite wisdom, Europe, of course, takes away Germany's ability to produce, takes away their key mining areas like the Rhineland, key industrial facilities. So Germany does not have the ability to make money to be able to pay to Britain and France. So Britain and France wind up not being able to pay the United States, and the United States is left holding the bag. So the United States has to come up with a way to get paid. So this is the big plan. This is the big debt restructuring plan of the 1920s. It's called the Dawes Plan. Don't think of, the Dawes Severalty Act. This is the Dawes Plan. The U.S. is going to give loans to Germany. Germany will take that loan money and pay their war reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France will then take that money and pay the United States.
Don't sound too smart.
It works
Yes.
It works so well.
Yes. It's insane. It's insane.
It's like a boomerang.
Now, you've got all this insanity. And then, the Depression hits. So how do countries react to the Depression? Because while the American economy caused the Depression, American policies like the Holy Smoot tariff and other tariff bills make it impossible for other countries to sell their goods in the United States, and it winds up dragging the rest of the world into depression. And whereas the United States has, the wealth to be able to absorb the shock of the Depression, and the government, goes through the New Deal and deficit spending and pump priming and all that stuff. Other countries are going to resort to more drastic means because they don't have the resources. Case in point, Japan. I tried to find something as bone-chilling as possible. Japan decides that rather than be tied to the rest of the world, they are going to be economically and militarily independent. They are tired of being pushed around and told what to do by the other world powers. They're going to do things on their terms. Now, Japan, as you rightfully put it, is an island. It is a series of volcanic islands the size of Montana. In terms of natural resources, Japan has none. They have to import everything, which means that they are an empire that is reliant on other countries for their well-being, and they don't want to be that anymore. They want their own sources of coal and oil and other resources that they can use for themselves. They don't want to have to rely on anybody else. And so, in 1931, the Japanese, who are now under a militaristic government, the military has basically taken charge of the government. They are going to invade Manchuria, the northeast region of China. Guys, this is a clear violation of what?
Kellogg-Briand.
It's a clear violation of Kellogg-Briand. It's a clear violation of what else?
Yeah.
What? 4-power treaty? 9-power treaty? It's a violation of the open door policy. And yet, what's the reaction? The League does nothing. The United States does nothing. So what does that tell Japan? Whatever, I do what I want. The only thing the United States does is it issues that's exactly what it is. And I was just about to do that, Zach. Good job. Bad, Japan. You're bad. Bad. Don't do that again. You violated the open door. And every other freaking treaty you signed. You're bad, Japan. But the United States is showing a reluctance to do anything, and I would argue it is primarily because the United States has got bigger fish to fry with the Depression. You got 25% of the American people out of work. Want to go to war with Japan? No. Yeah, we'll give them some work, yeah. Well, hey, I mean, look, ultimately, it does. Building up for World War II is what gets America out of the Depression. In Italy, you've got Mussolini. They're building up their military. They're looking to expand their empire in the 1930s. They invade Libya and Ethiopia. And maybe you've heard of the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie. Okay? Haile Selassie goes to the League of Nations and says, Italy has invaded my country. I need you to do something about it. And the League just sits around and strokes their beard and clucks their tongue and says, wow, boy, that's a real problem you got there. Now, of course, Italy can't secure Libya and Ethiopia. It actually requires help from the Germans. I love Mussolini. Just what a blowhard. Look at him there.
I'm standing on a tiny tank. Look at it.
Russia, under Stalin now, okay, Stalin comes to power in 1924, Russia feels that their ideology, their communist ideology, is vindicated. That maybe capitalism doesn't work. So the Depression actually bolsters Stalin and the communists in believing that, maybe the future is for communism. And if you take a look at what the United States is doing in some of the New Deal programs, some people would argue that that's very kind of quasi-socialistic, communistic, government control of the economy, government dictating prices and wages. That a lot of that NIRA stuff that was struck down is unconstitutional. People would argue, hey, that's kind of borderline communism right there. The real kicker of the Depression the economic problems, the shabby treatment, the punishment, basically everything that's laid out in the Treaty of Versailles to punish Germany leads to the election of Adolf Hitler. Election of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in the 1930s. 1933. Hitler is elected Chancellor of Germany with the promise that Hitler will restore Germany to its former glory, that Germany is not going to get kicked around anymore. And Germany starts to build up its military in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. It starts to build up its navy, the Kriegsmarine, its army, the Wehrmacht, and its air force, the Luftwaffe. I love German. It's just such a beautiful language. Why do Germans always sound like they're angry? I mean, I don't know. Why though? Happy, beer drinking people. And so Germany, under Hitler, is going to begin to build up its military in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. They're going to start to occupy territories that had been taken away from them in the Treaty of Versailles, and there's going to be very little that anybody does about it. One, because the Depression has affected everybody, and nobody has the economic wherewithal to do anything. And secondly, because everybody wants to avoid another war. They do not want to have another world war. So again, this really is kind of hiding under a pile of coats. In the 1930s, what is the United States doing? Generally ignoring what's going on in Japan, generally ignoring what's going on in Italy and Africa, generally ignoring what's going on in Europe. That's their problem. We're going to worry about our own backyard. So a lot of FDR's foreign policy in his first term is devoted to promoting trade in the Western Hemisphere. He's promoting what he calls the good neighbor policy. Yeah, we're done invading you with our big stick, and we're done, dollar diplomacying and banana republicing and invading your country to find bad guys. We're not going to do that anymore. We're gonna be nice to you guys, as long as you're nice to us. And we're going to trade with you guys, as long as you trade with us. And basically what FDR is trying to do is he's trying to keep the Western Hemisphere on America's side. By promoting trade, by promoting good relationships, by forswearing the idea of invading Latin American countries that are guilty of chronic wrongdoing. It's almost a repudiation of the Roosevelt corollary. Treat Latin America with some respect. After all, we're shaking hands with our Mexican neighbors here with their, I mean, that is just so absolutely ridiculous with the sombrero. Good God. As Japan, Germany, Italy are expanding their war efforts throughout the world, the United States, rather than engage in it, is going to shrink away from it. Gerald Nye of North Dakota had a congressional committee that investigated America's role in World War I. What the Nye Committee revealed in its report between 1934, 35, and 36, what Nye concluded was that American bankers and industrialists had been merchants of death, that we had gotten into World War I not to promote democracy, but to recoup the money we were losing from all the sales that we were making to Europe. And that the best way to avoid getting into a war in the future is to not sell goods or make loans to any countries involved in war. So the Nye Committee leads to the passage, the Nye Committee report leads to the passage of what become known as the Neutrality Acts.
What was his report
He was looking at how the United States got involved in World War I. And his investigation revealed that World War I was not primarily to spread democracy. It was pushed by bankers and industrialists to recoup their money. That they were selling weapons, they were making loans to European countries, and they wanted to recoup their losses. It was all about money. The Nye report convinced millions of citizens that the bankers who had lent money to the European allies had indeed been merchants of death and had tricked the country into war. I mean, why did we go to war with Iraq? I thought it was to promote freedom. I thought it was to promote democracy. We're going to go over to Iraq. We're going to promote democracy. We're going to give them blue jeans and Coca-Cola. I thought that's why we went to Iraq. Or was it oil? I don't know. See, I mean, it all depends on your perspective. Did we go into World War I to promote the spread of democracy, or did we go to World War I in order to make money? Nye is saying we went to war to make money, and that's how we got involved. So, if we stay back, if we stay out, we can avoid a war. So we just don't sell anything to any country that's hostile. And this, I would argue, 1934, 35, 36 is the heyday of this neutrality idea, that the United States is not going to engage in trade with any country who is even remotely warlike. So Japan, Germany, Italy, we're not trading with them. You know what? Oh yeah. There we go. Belligerent. Big fancy word. Belli. Bellum. Bellicose. War. Means war. Okay? Latin. Belli. Bellus. Belli. Mandatory arms embargo with belligerents, countries at war. We're not going to sell weapons. We're not going to allow Americans to travel on ships owned by countries at war. We're not going to provide any loans to countries at war. We're not going to arm American warships, or we're not going to arm American merchant ships. Now this, down here, notice this is 1935, 36, 37, 38, 39. Every year, they're passing neutrality acts. They're renewing them each year. In 1939, this is added to the neutrality acts. It's called cash and carry. What happened in 1939, all you military historians out there? September 1st, 1939. Poland, the beginning of World War II in 1939. So America realizes that Britain and France stand against Hitler. So the Neutrality Act of 1939 basically says if Britain and France want to come to the United States and buy our crap, they can. But they got to bring their own ships and they got to have cash because we're not taking any loans. That's called cash and carry. It's part of the Neutrality Act of 1939, but it signals a shift in neutrality. How can we really be neutral if we're willing to sell weapons to Britain and France? Hey, Bernard Baruch, I remember him as the guy that coordinated the war effort with businesses during World War I. Guy knows what he's doing. Now, while the United States is hiding behind this shield of neutrality, other things are happening around the world that, are causing consternation. There's a civil war in Spain between fascists and communists in 1936. Guys, all you need to know is that there's a Spanish Civil War. Don't worry about this. It is never on the test. I just wanted to make mention of it. The Luftwaffe! Yeah, the Spanish Civil War is where Hitler tests out his Air Force to see if it works. The Russians also send troops. Americans actually go and fight in the Spanish Civil War as mercenaries. They're called one of them was called the Lincoln Brigade.
No, don't they lose their citizenship though?
I don't know, I forget.
Because I know when Americans wanted to fight, I know when they wanted to be pilots, someone wanted to fly.
Right, a lot of Americans went over and flew for the British quietly.
They lose their citizenship.
Yeah. Look, the Spanish Civil War was just an opportunity for the countries who are going to be involved in World War II to try out their stuff in Spain. It's a proxy war. German expansion. Germany is going to take the Rhineland. Germany is going to Anschluss Austria. Germany is going to take the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. Yeah, wow, a European country that hosts an Olympics and then decides right after that Olympics while it's on that high to absorb other territories around it. I've never heard of such a thing. The cynicism, I know. And what is the world doing? Nothing. Nothing. What did the world do when Germany invaded the Rhineland? Nothing. What did they do when Germany like Anschluss is a verb. The Anschluss. But what did they do when Germany Anschlussed Austria? Nothing. Yeah. Yes, they were concerned. What did they do when Hitler demanded the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia? They held a conference. We'll talk about it. You laugh, folks, but guys, you got the same crap going on today. And I'm not saying that Putin is Hitler. I mean, Putin looks a lot better with his shirt off than Hitler ever did. But, Putin could pull that off, the, shirtless horseback riding. I mean, wrestling bears or tigers or whatever he does. Yeah, he's judo, karate. I'd like to see Barack Obama try that. Hey,
I might have to do that.
In Japan, the United States, actually this is in China, the United States sends observers to China to observe the Japanese invasion of China. We're observing it. Yes, that's quite an invasion you got there. But ships like the Panay are what are called gunboats. They are river boats that are, they travel up and down the major rivers in China to observe. Well, one of these boats, the Panay, gets bombed by the Japanese. And the Japanese are like, oh, sorry, we didn't mean to hit your boat. We were hitting other boats. We didn't mean to hit your boat. And they apologize for it. But this is all part of a larger invasion of China in 1937. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931 and set up a puppet government in there, which they called Manchukuo. But then in 1937, they invade the rest of China. And again, the League does nothing. The United States sends observers. Yeah. Wow, this is great. I wonder how it's going to end. Now, Roosevelt has got a difficult time here because he's got to walk a very fine line between it's funny because he couldn't. But he's got to roll a very fine line here between the predominant sentiment in the United States, which is neutrality, stay out, and the realization that, wow, Hitler and the Japanese, they're really bad guys, and somebody should do something. Somebody should get those guys. So, Roosevelt tries to be cute about it. He delivers a speech in 1937, which is referred to as the quarantine speech. That America looks at what Japan and Germany and Italy are doing almost as a disease. And that the best way for the United States to inoculate itself from the disease is to quarantine itself. Back in the day, if you were sick, if you had the measles or the chicken pox or polio, which was, that's FDR, polio, there you go. What they would do is they would quarantine your house. Nobody could come in, nobody could go out. Quarantine. Huh? How do you eat? Better have some food there. I mean, it's like a week. I mean, for instance, polio polio only was contagious for a couple of days. When you first contracted it, it was only contagious for a couple of days. My mom had polio. And that was before the polio vaccine in the 1950s. So my mom was like, this was 1948, 49. And my mom had polio and was contagious for like 2 or 3 days. And I know my grandmother's house was quarantined. But Roosevelt looks at this as an epidemic and that the United States must inoculate itself and we must quarantine these warring countries. Now, how you're going to do that, I have no idea. Because the rest of Europe, the rest of the world powers seem like they're willing to do anything to avoid a war. For instance, when Hitler demands the Sudeten region of Czechoslovakia, Britain, France, Russia, the United States even sent a representative, they give in to Hitler. They give Hitler the Sudeten region of Czechoslovakia. Germany says that the Germans living in Czechoslovakia are being threatened. The Russians living in Crimea are being threatened by the Ukrainian government. I mean, it's the same argument, it's the same thing. Yeah. Czechoslovakia wasn't even a real country. It was just made up. I mean, the Czechs and the Slovaks are different people. And yet, Wilson and the rest of these clowns at the end of World War I just lumped them together in one country that nobody could spell. And yet, here in this instance, Chamberlain and Daladier, or Edouard Daladier, the president of France, and Mussolini is there looking all notorious and stuff. But they're willing to give in to Hitler with the belief that if they just give Hitler what he wants, maybe it will avoid a conflict. I have just come back from a meeting with Herr Hitler, and I believe we have achieved peace in our time. I mean, when you say Neville Chamberlain today, I mean, I've heard that criticism leveled at Barack Obama, that he's acting like Neville Chamberlain, giving in to the Russians. To which I would then say, what would you like the United States to do? Invade Russia? I'm just wondering what the alternative is. Because if you'd like to invade Russia, I mean, we can do that. I mean, we're in the neighborhood. I mean, we're in Afghanistan. I mean, it's a hop, skip, and a jump. Boom. You're there. Boom. We got 10 aircraft carriers. They got 1. We got 4,000 nuclear missiles. They've got 1,000. Sure, go ahead. Spin the wheel, Raggedy Man. See what happens. World War II begins September 3rd, 1939, after Britain and France declare war on Germany. Germany had promised in the Munich Agreement that if they got the Sudetenland, they wouldn't demand any more territory. Yeah. Then they invaded Czechoslovakia, and Britain and France said, if you invade one more country, one more, then we're gonna be mad. And that's when the Germans invaded Poland. The Germans had signed a non-aggression pact with the Russians. Basically, the Russians and the Germans agreed to split up Poland until such time as Germany would then invade Russia. Hitler making the same mistake Napoleon made. And what is the United States' reaction to all of this in 1939? I would argue that the majority opinion in the United States is to stay out of this conflict. Charles Lindbergh, well, yeah, I mean, what is the symbol of George Washington being in back of Charles Lindbergh there? Neutrality, exactly. That is a purposeful image there that they're trying to evoke. That George Washington had warned in 1797 to avoid foreign entanglements. And Lindbergh is saying in 1940, he's saying we need to put America first. Let the rest of the world go up in flames if it wants. We need to worry about us. Is there wisdom in that? Okay. What do you mean?
Then we have to worry about ourselves if the whole world goes into flames. They're going to eventually come after us too.
You're going to have to fight them. I mean, you can hide under a pile of coats. You can ignore what's going on in the rest of the world. But unless you step up and do something, it will eventually come to bite you. And America is not just a power that just trades with itself. It's got to trade with the rest of the world. And if the rest of the world is going to be unstable, that impacts America at home. So I think here is where Americans start to realize maybe it's better if we are in the lead in trying to affect world change, rather than sitting back and letting the rest of the world do it, because the rest of the world's screwing it up. But if we are out in front of it, if we make the world in our image, perhaps, maybe, it will be better off for the United States in the long run. But that's a real big leap, my friends. I mean, you've had, except for the hiccup there of World War I, where, we joined the alliance, you've had, almost 200 years here of neutrality and sticking within the Western Hemisphere, and now people are starting to think, well, maybe that's not such a hot idea. Because the rest of the world can't seem to get out of their own way. Maybe it requires the United States to be fully engaged. Roosevelt cannot, and Roosevelt realizes this, Roosevelt knows that the United States needs to be the major player in the world. But he doesn't have the political cover to be able to do it, since most people in 1940 still subscribe to this. So he's got to be real careful about what he says and what he does. That's why you've got cash and carry in 1939. Roosevelt knows that Britain and France need military equipment, but we're not about to ship it on American ships. If Britain and France wants this equipment, they've got to bring their own truck and pay their own freight. We're like the military version of IKEA. Yeah, our stuff is already assembled, and you can't put it together with an Allen wrench. The friggin' Allen wrenches I have at home, all the IKEA crap I bought. All right. Now, Roosevelt gets elected. I probably should put a slide in here that shows the re-election for a third term in 1940. Roosevelt gets elected to an unprecedented third term in 1940. You've got Hitler invading in Europe. You've got a world war going on. You're coming out of the Depression. And Roosevelt makes the argument that we don't have, that with the world in such turmoil, we don't have the opportunity, or we shouldn't have the opportunity, to basically train a new president. He says, don't switch horses in midstream. That's the slogan in 1940. Don't switch horses in midstream. I realize that I'm breaking the two-term precedent, but I'm needed. And the American people generally agree, because the Republicans put up as their nominee in 1940 a Chicago businessman named Wendell Willkie. Wendell doesn't get elected president. Neither does Alf. Now, when Roosevelt gets re-elected in November 1940, one of the first things he does is he institutes a peacetime draft in December 1940. He waits until he gets a third term, and then he starts to act. And in 1941, early 1941, Roosevelt takes cash and carry and basically ignores it and says, we are going to lend materials to the British and the French and the Russians who had now been invaded by Germany. We're going to lend supplies to China and other countries. And he says, look, man, it's not like we're getting involved in a war, because people still believe in neutrality. It's not like we're getting involved in this war. Think of it this way. Think of it like your neighbor's house is on fire, and all you're doing is lending him a garden hose in order to put the fire out. You're not doing it for him. Dude, it's a $48 billion garden hose. That's a big garden hose.
It's a big fire.
That's a big fire. Well, that's a fire. But yeah, so we're not even couching it in terms of cash and carry. It's here, take it, use it. You know, we give destroyers, we give tanks, we give planes, we give guns, bullets. We give everything with the idea that, with the promise that we get all this stuff back. That's how it's couched to the American people. We're just lending it. We're going to get it back.
You're gonna get the bullets back.
The bullets, yeah. The bullets, the tanks, the planes, they get shot down. We get them back. But no, I mean, Roosevelt is basically, Roosevelt knows we're going to get involved in this war. Roosevelt knows we're going to get involved in this war before the American people know that we're getting involved in this war. So he is trying to lay the groundwork so that we're not caught off guard like we were in World War I. In January 1941, Roosevelt starts to lay out an ideology, kind of a mission statement for the United States. He knows the United States is going to get involved in this war. So why are we doing it? He wants to lay that message out. So January 1941, he's inaugurated for a third term. And he lays out what he sees as America's mission in the world. And see if it sounds familiar. In the future days, we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want. And the fourth is freedom from fear. Yes?
Is the second freedom to worship any god?
Any God you want. Or no God. But you have that religious freedom. You've got that freedom to speak out, freedom to worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. And that the United States has got to be the primary motivator in ensuring those freedoms. That's what we are about. We are about freedom. That is how it is couched. Noble sentiments. Does this idea sound familiar?
Sounds like Wilson. We're making the world
It's
stable.
Wilson Redux. Yes, this is Wilson Redux. This is the 14 points condensed to 4. Roosevelt, I love this picture. Roosevelt meets with the new Prime Minister of Great Britain in mid-1941, before the United States is involved in World War II. Notice how he is portrayed, Zach. He's standing. Look at his pant cuffs. They're extra long to cover up the braces, so nobody sees the braces.
So like Forrest Gump.
Yeah, like Forrest Gump's braces, yeah.
The boons are rigid, aren't they? It's just for him to be able to.
It's just for him to be able to stand up, to have the illusion of being able to stand up. There are only 2 pictures in existence of Franklin Roosevelt in a wheelchair. Yeah.
How does he move? Like, does he have to stand there the whole time?
Yeah. Yeah.
Isn't that a little? So he must have people that always.
He's got an entire coterie of people around him that basically move him. Everybody knew Franklin Roosevelt had polio and that it affected him. They just didn't know how bad. The bulk of the American people did not know Franklin Roosevelt was paralyzed until after he was dead. That's how big a state secret that was. That's how good they kept it. FDR and Churchill meet in August 1941, basically to discuss what would happen if the United States, and I'm just saying if, and this is a big if, what would happen if the United States got involved in World War II and sided with Britain? Not saying that we are, but what would happen? They agree that this would be a war not to acquire territory, to provide economic aid and support to the world, to ensure freedom from those living under tyranny, self-determination for all. Wait a minute, I've read this somewhere before. This is the 14 points. It's just FDR hey, this, 14 points. All right, Churchill, what do you think of this? Freedom of the sea. My God, it is the 14 points. Collective security in an organization that actually has the ability to do something. Sorry. So in the Atlantic Charter, the agreement between FDR and Britain is basically that if this war goes down and the United States is involved, the United States and Britain are going to oversee the post-war world. That the United States is not going to disengage like it did at the end of World War I, that we are going to be fully engaged at the end of World War II to guarantee these ideas. So it is the fulfillment of the ideas of the 14 points. The United States, what did they do when Japan invaded China? We placed an embargo against Japan. We didn't sell them stuff. As Japan expanded in Asia, the U.S. cut off supplies of oil, steel, scrap metal, etc. Japan needed those supplies in order to maintain its military. We were the #1 supplier of oil. We were the Saudi Arabia of oil in the 1940s. We were the #1 oil producer in the world. They needed steel. We were the #1 producer of steel. They needed scrap metal. We were the #1 supplier of scrap metal in the world. Japan needed the materials they got from the United States to promote their military. When we cut off that supply, Japan had to find supplies elsewhere, which forced them to invade other countries, which just made the United States even more angry, and we cut off more supplies. So you basically had irreconcilable differences between the United States and Japan, a breakdown in the relationship. And Japan decides that the #1 obstacle to their complete independence in the Pacific is, and has been, the United States. So how do you get rid of the United States as an obstacle? Well, to hear the news reports, the majority of American people are in favor of isolationism. So if we take out their fleet, maybe the United States will say, yeah, okay, you can have all of Asia. That's the idea behind the attack on Pearl Harbor. The idea was that the Japanese would deal a crippling blow to the American fleet, that America would not be able to militarily react in the Pacific, and by the time America could react, they would not be able to dislodge the Japanese. And the Japanese legitimately believed, the Japanese government legitimately believed that the United States would not fight back. That's what Franklin, look, this is all Franklin Roosevelt needs. Is this attack?
27, your morning announcement will be on shortly.
And of course, everybody always asks the question, did FDR know that Pearl Harbor was going to happen and let it happen so that it would have an excuse to declare war and go to war, a war that he knew he had to get into anyway? There's no evidence out there that FDR knew, but it does give Roosevelt the opportunity to sign the war declaration on December 8, 1941. And then America has got to go about organizing for war.